Lesson 9. Life in Tudor England. Society in Tudor England had a clearly defined social structure, with few people moving up the social ladder. Where you were in society determined what jobs you held, the homes you lived in, what food you ate, and even what clothes you were allowed to wear. The social structure consisted of the royal family. At the top of the social structure were the monarchs and the royal family. They held the highest authority and power in the country. Then you had the nobility. The nobility consisted of aristocrats, lords and ladies. The nobility enjoyed privileges and held significant political influence. They owned vast estates and were often granted titles and lands by the monarch. They enjoyed luxurious lifestyles with access to fine clothing, elaborate feasts and entertainment. They had servants to attend to their needs and often engaged in hunting, jousting and other leisure activities. Below the nobility were the gentry. The gentry were wealthy landowners, but they did not possess noble titles. The gentry were considered the upper middle class and held positions of local authority, such as the justices of the peace or members of parliament. They often lived in manor houses and were responsible for managing their own estates and tenants. Then you had the yeomanry. The next social class was the yeomanry. They were prosperous landowners, but not as wealthy as the gentry. They were often farmers or skilled craftsmen and held positions of respect within their communities. They lived in smaller houses or cottages and were responsible for managing their own land and businesses. Near the bottom of the social ladder was the labouring classes. These included a wide range of occupations. The group consisted of skilled and unskilled workers, such as artisans, merchants, labourers and servants. They were the majority of the population and lived in towns and cities working in various trades and professions. Poor and vagrants. At the very bottom of the social structure were the poor and the vagrants. These individuals were often unemployed, homeless or unable to support themselves. The Tudor government implemented laws to control and punish vagrancy, as they were seen as a threat to the social order. Many people did live in cities, but the majority of the population, 90%, lived in small villages and earned their livings working in farming. Poor Tudors had very hard lives. They would work 6 days a week, only having holy days and public holidays off. If the harvest failed, they wouldn't have anything to fall back on and would starve. As well as the harvest failing, plagues or epidemics of diseases would make the lives and money worse for the poor. Fashion and beauty. What we know of Tudor fashion has been learnt mostly from the portraits of the rich. Very few items of clothing have lasted, and the poor couldn't afford portraits. The silhouette of the Tudor fashion for both men and women was characterised by a broad-shouldered triangular shape. Men wore padded doublets and hose, while women wore gowns with fitted bodice and a full skirt. Rich fabrics such as velvet, silk and brocade were favoured by the upper classes. These fabrics were often embellished with intricate embroidery, jewels or gold and silver thread. Fur trims, especially ermine, were very popular. Rich Tudor women. Rich Tudor women would wear several layers of clothing to try and achieve the desired fashionable look. Clothes would be designed to keep them warm, as castles could be very cold if you weren't stood near to the fire. Women would wear a linen shift, a bone-framed skirt called a farthingale, which would go over their legs to give their shapes to their skirts, a kirtle, which was made up of a bodice and underskirt, an outer dress with sleeves, which would be made from expensive materials and have jewels sewn on, a girdle, which was worn like a fancy belt and would have expensive jewels on it, a linen cap, and a fancy headdress. Styles varied as fashions changed. By the Elizabethan era, they'd gone from a hood covering the hair to elaborate hairstyles with decorations. Rich Tudor men. They would wear a shirt, which would be a white silk shirt with frills at the collars and cuffs, then a doublet, which was a fitted jacket with padded and worn down to their legs. Hose, these were tight-fitting trousers. Henry VIII was so tight, they led to him to suffer from varicose veins. They'd then have garters. These were tied around the legs to hold up the hose. They'd finish it off with a ruff, which was an elaborate pleated collar that was cleaned and starched daily by specialist laundresses. And lastly, men would have hats, such as a large flat cap or a tall conical hat known as a sugar loaf. Now the Tudors had very strange beauty practices, and many turned out to be quite deadly. They were influenced by the ideals of the time, which emphasised pale skin, a high forehead and a small waist. Tudor beauty practices included white makeup. Being pale was seen as beautiful, as it was a sign of wealth. The majority of people in Tudor era had to work in the fields and would have gotten quite strong suntans. If you were super pale, it showed that you didn't need to work. Elizabethan women would use white lead like face paint to make their faces look paler. The more they used, the more likely they were to die from lead poisoning. They'd then use dyes to contrast with their paler skin. Women would use natural dyes and cosmetics to enhance their lips and cheeks. They'd use substances like crushed berries or beetroot to create a red tint. Black teeth. Now you might think the look of black teeth is quite gross, but after the introduction of sugar to the Tudors' diets, those who were rich enough to indulge in it would often develop black, rotting teeth. This was due to a lack of dental hygiene. Queen Elizabeth I's teeth were black and falling out. Because of this, it was seen as a sign of being rich, and so it actually became fashionable to have black teeth. Hairlines. Women would pluck or shave their hairline to create a high forehead, which was considered attractive. They'd even wear elaborate hairdresses or wigs to cover the shaved areas. Eyebrows. Women would pluck their eyebrows to be perfectly arched and thin. They would then darken them using various methods, such as applying a soot or using a mixture of walnut oil and black lead. Hairstyles. Tudor women had elaborate hairstyles, often incorporating braids, curls, and intricate hairpieces. They'd use false hairpieces known as perukes to create a voluminous style. Perfumes. Perfumes and scents were popular during the Tudor era. Women would use fragrances made from flowers, herbs and spices to mask the bad body odours and create a pleasant aroma. Remember, the Tudors didn't really wash, so the smells would have been quite strong and intense. Tudor children. Tudor children had a very different childhood to your life. Most didn't survive, with 25% dying before their 25th birthday and 40% by their 16th. This is because of a lack of successful medical treatment for illnesses and accidents. Only rich Tudor children would be sent to school. Everyone else would be expected to help with their parents' chores and jobs and get apprentices as they grew older. Even amongst the rich, few girls would be educated and none were sent to school. If the girls were lucky, they'd have home tutors who had taught them basic lessons, but mostly they were trained in how to run a household and what their expected duties would be when they were wives and mothers. School was typically led by a schoolmaster, who was often a clergyman or scholar. The schoolmaster was responsible for teaching and disciplining the students. They enforced strict rules and used corporal punishment as a means of maintaining discipline. Punishments would be quickly given by the teacher using birch twigs to cane them. They could give 50 strokes of the birch. Very rich children would hire a whipping boy who would take the punishments for them. The curriculum of Tudor schools revolved around the study of Latin, grammar, and classical literature. Students learned to read, write and speak Latin fluently. They also studied Greek, mathematics and some subjects related to religion and philosophy. Tudor boys would have special tablets called hornbooks. They would be boards with the alphabet or sheets of important writing attached. They'd then be covered with a thin sheet of cow's horn to protect it. Tudor schools had long hours, typically starting early in the morning and lasting until late at night. Students had limited breaks and were expected to focus on their studies for extended periods. Childhood was short-lived. At the age of 12, girls could be married, and boys often were by 14. Toys, games and leisure. The rich. Rich children would have toys made from wood, tin and lead. Toys would be often replicas of everyday objects, such as dolls' houses, wooden rocking horses, model ships and castles. Dolls made of cloth and wood were popular toys for Tudor children. These dolls were often handmade and dressed in simple clothing. Wealthier children might even have more elaborate dolls made of porcelain or other materials. Spinning tops were a common toy for both boys and girls. They are typically made of wood and spun by pulling a string or twisting a stick. Tudor children would compete to see whose top would spin the longest. Balls made out of leather and fabric filled with stuffing were popular toys for the outdoor play. Tudor children would play games like catch or kickball with these balls. Marbles made of clay or stone were used in various games. Tudor children would play games like knucklebones or ring toss, where they'd try and hit or knock over the other marbles. Tudor children enjoyed playing with hobby horses, which were wooden or fabric horses mounted on a stick. They pretend to ride the hobby horse and engage in imaginative play. The poor. Poor children would have to make their own toys from scraps of rubbish and materials found in the areas they lived. Games. Simple puzzles made of wood or metal were enjoyed by Tudor children. They also liked playing bowls. Bowls was a popular outdoor game played on a grassy surface. Players would roll wooden balls called bowls towards a target called a jack. The goal was to get the bowls as close to the jack as possible. They also enjoyed Nine Men's Morris. This was a strategic game played on a square grid. Players would take turns placing their pieces on the intersections of the grid and try to form rows of 3. Once a player formed a row, they could remove one of the opponent's pieces. The goal was to reduce the opponent's pieces to 2 to block their moves. It was a bit like a cross between Connect 4 and Tic-Tac-Toe. You can find your own game board to play Nine Men's Morris for free on our website at chattyzebracurriculum.com. Stoleball was a team game similar to cricket or baseball. Players would use a wooden bat to hit a ball and then run between two stalls or bases. The opposing team would try to catch the ball and get the batter out. Blind Man's Bluff was a very popular game. One player would be blindfolded and try to catch the other players, who would move around and try to avoid being caught. The blindfolded player would try to identify and tag the other players by touch. Horseshoes was a game played outdoors. Players would throw horseshoes towards a stake or peg in the ground, aiming to get their horseshoes as close as possible to the target. Card games were popular among the upper classes. These games involved betting and strategic play with a deck of cards. Chess was very popular in the Tudor era. It's a strategic board game enjoyed by the wealthier individuals. It involved moving different pieces on a checkered board with the objective of catching the opponent's king. Tudor Leisure. The 12 Days of Christmas was the most festive celebration in the Tudor calendar. Both rich and poor would celebrate as elaborately as they could. A lord of misrule was instructed and in charge of organising games and entertainment, such as Blind Man's Bluff, plays and mummering, and costume parties. Mumming. This was performed by acting troupes which told stories and included singing minstrels, Morris dancers and musicians. May Day. This was celebrated with dancing around a maypole, and a May Queen would be crowned. Gambling. This was enjoyed throughout the year. Cheaters would load their dice by making them heavier on one side. Dice would be made from bone, ivory, wood, or silver or gold if you were really rich. Tennis. The rich would play a form of tennis. Henry VIII particularly liked it and went to great expense to build a court at Hampton Court Palace. Cudgel. One violent game the Tudors played was called Cudgel. This was where two opponents would have long sticks, and the winner was the first person to draw blood from the other's head. Tudors also enjoyed wrestling. Sword play. This was done both for entertainment and for sword training. Archery. Henry VIII loved archery so much that he ruled that every male subject should keep a longbow in their house, and fathers were expected to teach their sons to shoot. Hunting. One of their greatest passions was hunting. To go hunting, they'd ride horses and use hunting dogs. Popular breeds were mastiffs, spaniels, greyhounds and bulldogs. If you were really rich, you might use a hawk. Hawking in itself was seen as a fun leisure pursuit. Animal blood sports. Cockfighting and bear baiting were watched by the masses. Tournaments. But the most popular of events was tournaments and jousts. Henry VIII would eagerly take part in them himself. Music. This was enjoyed by all, and the Tudor monarchs could all play instruments and compose music themselves. The lute was a popular instrument. Dancing. With music came dance. More and more elaborate dances were invented, a favourite being La Volta. Henry VIII loved dancing and incorporated them into huge masquerades alongside of feasts, play acting and music. Plays. Theatre was a significant form of entertainment during the Tudor era. Plays and performances were held in public theatres as well as the courts and nobility. The most famous playwright of the time was William Shakespeare. Reading and writing were leisure activities enjoyed by the educated elite. Books, especially religious texts, were highly valued, and individuals would spend time reading and discussing literature. They also enjoyed house crafts such as needlework, embroidery, and other crafts. Tudor homes. The classic Tudor house is recognisable by its exposed wooden timbers. These timbers would be blackened and provided structure. The walls between would be painted white. They had tall, narrow windows and doors, and Tudor homes also had large chimneys. They had a large upper floor which would overhang the lower floor. Buckets would be used for toilets, would be emptied by throwing the contents from the upper windows out onto the street below. Imagine if you were the person walking underneath. Roofs would be thatched using straw or reeds. The floors were dirt floors covered in reeds or rushes. These needed to be changed regularly. Herbs would be sprinkled in amongst them to make them smell nicer. Glass was expensive, so only the rich could afford it for their windows. Poorer people would have to block the windows with shutters made from wood or horn. Furniture was made from oak. Instead of chairs, Tudors would often sit on stools or benches, which wouldn't have been very comfortable. Palace walls were decorated with portraits and hanging tapestries. The wealthy nobility and gentry lived in grand manor houses. These houses were typically large and impressive, with multiple wings, courtyards and gardens. They often had multiple stories, with a ground floor used for public functions and the upper floors for private living quarters. In urban areas, the wealthy would have townhouses. These were typically narrow, multi-storey buildings with a small footprint due to the limited space. Townhouses often had shops or businesses in the ground floor, with living quarters above. The majority of the population lived in small thatched roof cottages made of timber and wattle and daub. These cottages were often single-storey and had a central hearth for cooking and heating. There were typically a few windows and limited space, with 1 or 2 rooms serving multiple purposes. Peasants and labourers lived in simple one-room huts made of mud and straw and thatch. These dwellings were basic and lacked many amenities. They often had dirt floors and minimal furniture.